Letters arrived in canvas sacks. They came from collection boxes, from regional centers, from other cities. The sacks were emptied onto metal tables in rooms lined with sorting frames. Workers stood at those frames and moved each piece of mail into compartments based on destination. There were no machines to read addresses. There were no codes printed on envelopes that could be scanned. Every letter required a human decision, a glance at the handwriting, recognition of the street name or the town, placement into the correct slot. The process repeated thousands of times per shift. Mail moved because workers remembered where things went. Routes were held in memory. Regions were divided into sequences that could be recalled without reference. Speed came from repetition. Accuracy came from attention sustained across hours. The system functioned because the same people returned to the same frames and performed the same tasks daily. Volume increased steadily. The sorting never stopped. Letters kept arriving. The sorting frame was a wall of pigeonholes. Each compartment corresponded to a delivery route or a regional destination. Frames were built in rows that faced the work floor. Workers stood and reached into bins of unsorted mail. They picked up each piece, read the address, placed it into the appropriate slot. The arrangement of compartments followed postal geography. Cities were divided into zones. Zones were divided into carrier routes. Routes were divided into street sequences. A single frame might hold 50 compartments. Larger facilities used multiple frames arranged by region. Workers moved between frames depending on where mail was headed. Each piece required a decision about which compartment it belonged in. Placement was manual. There was no automatic verification. If a letter was placed incorrectly, it entered the wrong delivery stream. It would travel to the wrong location. Sorting required spatial memory and constant reference to postal divisions that existed only in training and practice. New workers learned the system through memorization. They were given maps. They studied route numbers and street boundaries. They practiced sorting test batches under supervision. Speed increased with familiarity. A trained worker could sort hundreds of pieces per hour. The task was not complex, but it was unforgiving. Errors compounded across the system. A missorted letter in one facility might not be caught until it reached a carrier who recognized the mistake. Training focused on accuracy first. Speed developed naturally. Workers learned to recognize address patterns without reading every word. They identified regions by partial information, a street name, a zip code prefix, the shape of familiar handwriting. Experienced sorters worked without hesitation. Their hands moved in rhythm. Pick, read, place, repeat. Shifts were measured in volume processed. Performance was tracked by pieces handled and errors detected. The work required no special skill beyond memory and sustained attention. It required both consistently. Mistakes were inevitable. A letter placed in the wrong compartment traveled in the wrong direction. It might be caught at the next sorting facility. It might reach a delivery office in the wrong city. Carriers sometimes returned missorted mail to be routed again. Each error added delay. Each delay multiplied across thousands of pieces. Preventing mistakes required focus that did not waver. Workers double-checked unfamiliar addresses. Supervisors reviewed problem pieces. Some facilities employed verification sorters who re-examined mail flagged as uncertain. The cost of errors was not dramatic. It was cumulative. A single letter delayed by days, a package sent to the wrong state, time lost in rerouting, resources spent on correction. The system tolerated some level of error because perfection was unattainable at scale. But tolerance had limits. Repeated mistakes by individual workers drew attention. Retraining was common. Dismissal was possible. Accuracy mattered because the network depended on it. The volume was national. Millions of pieces moved daily. Every city, every town, every rural route, all required sorting. Mail entered the system continuously. It flowed through regional hubs. It was resorted at intermediate points. It reached local offices where final sorting occurred by carrier route. The entire network depended on manual sorting at multiple stages. There were no alternatives. Automation did not exist. The work could not be postponed. Letters that arrived today needed to be sorted today. Delay at one facility created backlog across the system. Workers returned each day to the same task. They stood at the same frames. They processed the same volume. The repetition was structural. Mail delivery was a daily commitment. The public expected consistency. Businesses depended on it. Communication relied on it. The sorting floors operated in shifts that covered all hours. Work continued overnight. It resumed each morning. The system never emptied. It only moved forward. The work was physical, standing for hours, reaching into bins, lifting sacks, arms extended to place mail in high compartments, hands repeating the same motions thousands of times, feet stationary on concrete floors. The task caused fatigue, shoulders ached, backs stiffened. Workers took breaks in rotation. They returned to the same position. Productivity declined as shifts progressed. Fresh workers sorted faster than those nearing the end of a long day. Management scheduled shifts to maintain throughput. Peak periods required additional labor. Holiday volume overwhelmed standard capacity. Temporary workers were hired. Overtime was assigned. The system operated at the edge of what manual labor could sustain. There was no way to increase speed beyond human limits. Sorting could not be accelerated by effort alone. Volume had a ceiling. That ceiling was the number of workers and the hours they could physically perform the task. Growth in mail volume required growth in staff. Facilities expanded. More frames were installed. More workers were hired. The process scaled only linearly. Automated sorting machines appeared in larger facilities first. They read addresses using optical scanners. They routed mail using mechanical arms and conveyor systems. They processed thousands of pieces per hour without fatigue. Workers were reassigned. Some moved to roles feeding machines or handling exceptions. Others left the postal system entirely. The sorting floors that once held rows of frames and dozens of workers were reconfigured. Machines occupied the space. The pigeonholes were removed. The frames were dismantled. Sorting became a machine function. Human workers remained for tasks that automation could not handle: damaged envelopes, illegible addresses, unusual items. But the volume of manually sorted mail dropped sharply. Facilities that had employed hundreds of sorters reduced staff to dozens. The work disappeared faster than workers could be retrained. The transition was not gradual. It was immediate in facilities where machines were installed. Mail continued to move. It arrived at the same pace. It reached the same destinations. The delivery did not pause. Some regional centers retained manual sorting longer. Smaller facilities without funding for machines continued using frames. Rural offices kept pigeonholes for local route sorting. Workers in these locations performed the same task they had always performed. But the trend was clear. Automation expanded. Machines were installed in more facilities each year. The remaining manual sorting operations were recognized as temporary. Eventually, those frames would be replaced. Those workers would be reassigned or released. The work existed in a state of gradual obsolescence. Everyone involved understood that the method was ending. Some workers retired before the transition reached their facility. Others waited. The sorting continued as long as the frames remained. When machines arrived, the frames were removed within days. The space was repurposed. The work stopped. No ceremony marked the change. The sorting simply ceased to be done by hand. Former sorting facilities were converted to other uses. Some became storage. Some were subdivided for administrative offices. The large, open floors that had held sorting frames were partitioned. The high ceilings that had allowed ventilation for rooms full of workers were no longer necessary. The architecture remained. The function changed. A few frames were preserved in postal museums. They stood empty. Visitors could see the compartments. They could read descriptions of how workers had sorted mail by hand. The explanations were brief. The process was not complex enough to require extensive interpretation. The frames were objects without context once the work was gone. They represented a method that had been universal and was now absent. The transition left no controversy. There was no debate about whether automation should have been adopted. The efficiency gain was absolute. The decision was economic. The sorting floors emptied because machines were faster. That was sufficient reason. Mail continued to arrive. It was sorted by machines. It moved through the same network. It reached the same addresses. Delivery did not change from the perspective of those receiving letters. The work that had made delivery possible simply shifted from human hands to mechanical systems. The speed increased. The volume capacity expanded. Errors decreased. The system functioned more reliably. Nothing was lost in terms of service. What disappeared was the labor itself. The knowledge workers had carried in memory, the rhythm of sorting sustained across a shift, the physical presence of people standing at frames in rooms filled with the sound of paper moving into slots. All of that ended quietly. The buildings remained. The delivery routes remained. The network remained. But no one stood at sorting frames anymore. Letters found their way to destinations without that work. They simply continued to arrive.